All right, well, welcome to the first Cougar Conversation of 2021. I'm Brian Kessel, Associate Professor of Political Science here at Columbia College, and one of the original founders of the Cougar Conversations discussion series. We've been on hiatus for a bit because of COVID, and so this is our first conversation on Zoom. So bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. The great thing about Zoom is that we've been able to assemble a wonderful panel from near and far for this event. Cougar Conversations started about 4 years ago to promote civic engagement on campus through a discussion of topical issues. Our goal was to go beyond the headlines to get more context and insight into important issues. Over the years, we've had conversations on immigration policy, the Second Amendment, tensions with North Korea, the Me Too movement, and more. Our conversation today concerns protest, media, social change, and democracy. We began talking about this topic back in December, thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests following the death of George Floyd. Then the storming of the Capitol happened in January, and we decided to broaden our theme to try and understand the whole range of protests that have occurred in America over the past year. To kick things off, we have a couple of poll questions for our audience that Sarah will be initiating. During the question and answer portion of today's event, please feel free to post questions in the Q&A or the chat, and our moderator will direct questions to the panelists. With all that out of the way, I'd like to get things started by introducing our moderator for today, Dr. Ahu Tabatabai, Associate Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Department of Psychology, Sociology, and Human Services.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Sarah, and everyone who helped in organizing this event. I was really pleased to be asked to be a part of it. And I'd like to welcome all of our panelists and our participants and attendees. In order to get our conversation started, I would like to offer us kind of a broad frame for the discussion through sort of a prompt question. And the way that we'll proceed is that I'll pose the question and then I'll introduce our panelists as they take up the question. So we'll do introductions and your answer. So the question that we sort of thought would be broad enough to capture the diversity of expertise on the panel is that in the US, there have been protests against police brutality for many decades. But in 2021, these protests became much more visible. They took center stage and captured national attention. The ongoing pandemic added a whole new level of complexity to public gatherings, which also elicited protests from those opposed to COVID-related restrictions. Most recently, at the beginning of 2021, we were faced with attacks on the national Capitol. From your point of view and respective discipline, what have we learned from this past year? And I'd like to begin with our first panelist, Ms. Ruby Bailey. Ruby is the executive editor of the Columbia Missourian, the first woman and the second African-American to hold this position in the publication's 113-year history. Bailey is also a journalism professor and the chair of the Community Newsletter Management at the University of Missouri.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here with you all. I would say among the lessons, because there hopefully were several, I'm not sure that there were, but hopefully there were several. But from a journalistic point of view and considering my role both here at the university as well as an executive editor of a media outlet that uses students as reporters, photographers, and just as journalists, one of the lessons that it's unfortunate that they had to learn was simply the lesson that we had to teach them that their safety could be so compromised right around the insurrection and around local protests here, maybe at the Capitol, or local demonstrations here after January the 6th, that we could not in good conscience allow them to go. So that lesson that we have been learning or seeing or teaching all along regarding the importance of the media, our role in democracy, that being under attack, and the importance of standing strong for that in multiple ways. In this instance, we saw literal messages about death to the media during the insurrection. We saw cameras and other equipment and journalists themselves being physically attacked and threatened with harm. So I think hopefully the lesson, though unfortunate, and for some of us very traumatic as journalists, as people of color, as women, some of us, although all of those things, the lesson was that there were several lessons. And one of them, unfortunately for our folks, is that I cannot send you in good conscience to cover an event at the state capitol, not because we think necessarily that everyone at the state capitol is going to be out to get you, but simply because I cannot guarantee your safety in a public space or coming and going from that space. So certainly that was a lesson that I think was really taught well. And it was an unfortunate yet necessary one in some ways, I think, for our journalism students. And it sparked several conversations, not just from journalism students, but from journalists that I know across the country. So the lesson about just making sure that we are out there as best as we can, yet remaining safe, and that there may come a time where our safety is so at risk that we literally cannot go. It was was probably one of the most prominent lessons, just as an educator and as someone who is training future journalists, that we had to teach them. So that I would say that was a painful yet necessary lesson.
Thank you. I'm going to move to our second panelist, Sergeant Sinclair. Sergeant Clint Sinclair has been serving with the Columbia Police Department for 11 years. He's currently supervises both community outreach as well as training and recruitment. He's also the LGBTQ plus liaison for that department. What have we learned, Sergeant Sinclair?
Thank you for having me on the panel today. From a policing perspective, I think the biggest thing we learned is that policing has to change. We have to do a better job of listening. And it's also important to keep in mind that the actions of a few police officers that we've seen across the nation don't necessarily represent every single police officer in this country. And we, as a profession, as a group, we have to do better. We have to listen to the concerns of the communities that we serve. We have to act on those concerns and sort of maybe let go of the paternalistic nature of policing, where we think we always know what's best when maybe we really don't. And we have to empower each other to solve problems in our community. We have to empower our officers to make good decisions that directly impact those that they serve, and empower the community to help enforce public safety and work toward public safety. I think the protests, especially locally, gave us a really good opportunity to just close our mouths and listen and hear what has been said for probably a long time, but as a profession, we maybe haven't listened or acted on quick enough.
Thank you. Our third panelist, Dr. Pete Simi. He's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Chapman University, and he's studied extremist groups and violence for more than 20 years. Pete is also the co-author of an award-winning book, American Swastika, Inside the White Power Movement's Hidden Spaces of Hate. Pete, what have we learned?
First, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think in short, we've learned how much work we have to do, especially in terms of trying to move towards a true multicultural democracy that respects all of its citizens. And if I may try and draw a through line from the protests that followed George Floyd's murder to what we saw January 6th insurrection. After George Floyd's murder, as the video footage circulated, a segment of white America, that was kind of a wake-up call, and it's sad and depressing that it took that video to kind of raise the level of consciousness. But that was one of the positives that came out of such a horrific tragedy, and we saw millions of Americans take to the streets in protests of all races, ethnicities, and so forth. But that wasn't the entirety of the reaction to that video. There were some people who saw that video, and we saw the reenactments of the murder, making fun of it, essentially, taking pleasure in it, on Facebook and other social media platforms. And we saw probably a larger segment of folks who responded to it and said, that's terrible that it happened, but what about George Floyd being a career criminal? Why aren't we talking more about that? And so that kind of indifference and really a kind of distorted reality we saw then fully manifest itself January 6th at the Capitol, where a sense of entitlement was truly being expressed by a mass mobilization, thousands of people who said, even if we're not going to accept the outcome of a presidential election because we don't like the outcome, and we're certainly not going to be told by people we don't consider to be fully citizens to tell us who our president's going to be. And we're going to stand by who we think should be president. And we're actually going to go to great effort to try and disqualify the vote of citizens across the country, but particularly targeting primarily African-American urban areas that made a substantial difference in the election. So we saw in response, I think, to a large extent, the January 6th insurrection is a response to the civil rights efforts that we saw really taking hold over the summer in terms of protests against police violence, but also more broadly in terms of protests demanding greater social justice.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Representative Rasheen Aldridge Jr. Rasheen Aldridge is a community organizer and a progressive Democrat. He was a leader in the local Fight for 15 movement. Aldridge was an activist during the Ferguson uprising and was later appointed by Governor Nixon to serve on the Ferguson Commission. He now serves in the Missouri House of Representatives of the 78th District. What have we learned, Representative?
Thank you so much for having me. I'll say three things, and I'll make sure I won't dwell on them too long. There's going to be opportunity to talk about them. As somebody who's been involved in the protests here in the city of St. Louis in the Ferguson area when the death of Mike Brown happened in 2014, 2017, Jason Stockley verdict, and then again, when we just recently seen the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and names that we continue to say. I would say, similar to what the captain said, there's still a lot of room for change and a lot of room for growth. And I know I'm young, but and young people sometimes want change quick, but I don't think we've really made enough change for communities of color to feel like that their lives or their voices are being heard. And it also, I think, true criminal justice reform is not just good for the community, but it's also good for law enforcement and relationships being built. I would say, seeing what happened at the Capitol January 6th, I would say that we're still very divided as a country. We don't want to listen to each other, but we want to continue to assume. And seeing what happened January 6th in the Capitol, and again, being involved in many protests, I think it goes to show the reality of the world a lot of people live in. There's a two-tail of worlds that we live in. Folks at the Capitol were able to, do things that have never been seen in our history, especially in my time. And I know from the protests that we've had here in the St. Louis area, or even when we came up to Jeff City, the response to the protest that we had was totally different to what we seen January 6th. You were able to see individuals breach several lines to the fact that several individuals are not just injured, but even death. And I would say during the Black Lives Matter protest, that has never happened. There's not been one activist here in the St. Louis area that has been killed or even, a physical interaction with law enforcement where we've physically injured them in a manner where they had to be off the job for a while. So I'll say those three things as far as, again, tales of two stories that we kind of live in. We're still very divided in this country, and the criminal justice reform that is not just beneficial for communities of color. I feel like when you say criminal justice reform, people think, oh, how does this just help the Black community, right? But it's also how do we, as being a legislator, there's bills that are being filed from the Republican side that are trying to figure out how do we get rid of some of the bad apples in law enforcement so that we can build a stronger relationship between communities of color and law enforcement, because we all want the same thing. We want safer streets, we want less crime, and we want to feel comfortable in the communities that they are protecting and serving, but residents also want to feel comfortable with the individuals that are supposed to protect and serve them.
Thank you. Our next panelist, Dr. Mary Beth Brown. Dr. Mary Beth Brown is a postdoc fellow in the Department of History at the University of Missouri. She researches African American history and focuses on student civil rights activism post-World War II in the Midwest, specifically at the University of Missouri and the University of Kansas. What have we learned, Dr. Brown?
Thank you for having me and thank you for attending. I want to highlight two things just briefly. I think the first thing is that we've kind of learned how ignorant we are of our history and its reality to what has happened in the past and what's happening now. And I think that this is really an important point to remember because it shows why it's so important to teach history, not only history, but also offer classes in Black history, LGBTQ history, Asian American history, Latino history, women's history. And remember too how most of these programs actually came out of the history of student activism across the country. So we have that history along with those. And then I think the second thing is to emphasize how the words we use matter. January 6th was not a protest. It was, I think we're still in discussions over what it is to call it. I know a lot of people right now are using insurrection, which is what I generally use too. And just think of this idea that there's a larger movement where we see a lot in scholarship, how we're changing the nomenclature of terming incidents such as the Tulsa race riots to calling them what they were, massacres. And so it's important that we look at words and how these words matter. And when I was preparing for this, I remembered after Charlottesville, the day the Charlottesville events happened, I posted on Facebook, so I'm going to kind of quote myself, sorry. But it was just that same day I was doing research for my topic, and I was researching Kansas, activism in Kansas. And in the 1940s, there was so much ignorance exhibited by public officials. And examples, two separate occasions, the Kansas governors in 1946 and 1947 were asked by people if they had a race relations committee in the state. And both of the governors said no. And in particular, one in 1946 said Kansas has no such problems and for this reason has no such committees. And it was really frustrating because in the same folder right after those letters, you have numerous letters from Kansas citizens talking about how they're being discriminated against in white-served businesses. So just to know that these things have happened, and it's often, we often want to think we live in a colorblind or a post-racial society, and they're not happening, but they are. And so that was all I had for this beginning part.
Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Dr. Ernest Perry. Dr. Perry is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies and Research at the Missouri School of Journalism. Dr. Perry has done research specifically on the media's role in serving underrepresented groups and the lack of ethnic minority journalists in the mainstream media. He's the author of Cross-Cultural Journalism and the Strategic Communication, Storytelling, and Diversity. Welcome, Dr. Perry. What have we learned?
Well, I would say that one of the things that sort of piggybacking off of what Dr. Brown was talking about, one of the things we've learned is that these kinds of incidents have happened in the past, and they will continue to happen as long as we don't sort of expose the reality that even though we talk about a post-racial society or a diverse society, that in reality we are more polarized now than we've been in a long time. I mean, I think you would almost have to go back to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, where you had where you literally had government-sanctioned Jim Crow, separate but equal laws, to think about a time period in which we were as polarized as we are now. And some would even say you go back almost to the time period just before the Civil War, that you would see some of the things that we've seen here, with the exception of the insurrection at the Capitol, which is something we've never seen before. So I think people need to be aware of the fact that you have this undercurrent of sort of angst and vitriol that has permeated throughout our politics and is now sort of being exposed not only through the mainstream media but also through social media. And in fact, some would say, and many are saying, that social media has given rise rise to many of these groups, or the ability for many of these groups not only to communicate between each other, but also to communicate out their message to a larger audience. So I think we're seeing a lot of that here. And then it's just sort of cultivate, you can really see it, and you saw it on January 6th.
Thank you. And just a reminder to our attendees that if you're interested in submitting a question to the panel, that you please go ahead and do so. And we will try to weave those questions into our discussion with the panel. If I can sort of throw a follow-up question based on all of your beginning remarks, it seems that the theme that echoes through is that we are at a particular moment right now where we are more divided than ever before. And if we were to find a comparison time, we would have to go quite a bit in the past. What does that say about the possibilities of protest right now? If this is an unprecedented time, what can we achieve in this particular moment? Anyone who would like to take?
I would say one of the things that we could achieve in this is, and I think all of the panelists alluded to that, is educating the public about what's going on here, and getting them to understand that even though it seems unprecedented, and there are some unprecedented instances that you're seeing in a lot of these events, this is, from a historical perspective, protests and these types of protests have been a part of the history of this country almost from its inception. And so protest is not a unique occurrence. I think what one of the unique things about this one is that these protests are being sparked by the change in technology and the use of that technology as a way to communicate across the country. I mean, in the past, protests you'd have one big protest in one particular area, and then others would hear about it and it would start. Whereas in the protests that you're seeing now, these protests will start in one place, and then hours later, that protest will pick up someplace else in another part of the country. And that I would say is unusual, but all of it is provides an opportunity for people to be able to engage in civil protests to really begin the conversation of how are we going to change, how are we going to move, and that's the one thing that I would say that people need to understand, is that protest is usually the beginning of the much larger and deeper conversation about how we are going to institute change. The protest is not the end point. The protest is the beginning point of the conversation. And those protests grow out of the frustration that many people have because their issues are not being addressed and they're not being heard.
Yeah, and I'll follow up with that a little bit from the police perspective. It's protests aren't police lined up with riot gear and an us against them mentality. That doesn't work. That didn't work during the civil rights movement, and it's not going to work now. It is that opportunity for a conversation. Well, we did see some areas of the country where we did see riot gear and we saw tear gas. We also saw a lot of agencies that were taking a knee with protesters, that were speaking as human beings to each other, that were meeting locally. We met with organizers before and after protests and talked about what would happen, how we could keep everybody safe, and really say, what do you want us to hear right now? So that, sparking the conversation is an excellent way to say that. And looking back on how stuff was handled by police during civil rights, they were absolutely a mechanism of the government, a true occupying police force, and that's just not what it needs to be today with the way protests are going in this country now.
Is it okay to say something?
Please do.
Okay. I want to just add a point to what Dr. Perry said, and then also what Representative Aldridge said, kind of joining the two together, is we have to, I think it's a good time to recognize that young people's voices matter and that young people can affect change. And sometimes their efforts are almost swept aside because people think they're too young to know what they're talking about or to know what the world is really like. And especially because I study student activism, a lot of the change starts with students. And even if they start as college students, a lot of them continue and go on as they get older. So it's important that we recognize the voice of students and that and young people, even non-students, and just recognize that they do have their voices are valuable.
So I'm looking at some of the questions that are being submitted, and one of them very specifically is about whether the former administration had a role to play in the events of January 6th. So do you believe that Donald Trump's presidency had a direct effect on the events that occurred on January 6th?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say this is I think an easy, quick one. Yes, I think it directly did. There's been Senate hearings where it was kind of traumatizing, just not being there, but just to see the images that were being played out in the Capitol and the comments that are coming from our commander in chief. Regardless of what side of the party of the aisle you're on, I don't think we've had a commander in chief like the previous one that we just had. So I think his comments not only directly impacted what happened at the Capitol, but I think it has also impacted the continued distance or the continued divisiveness that doesn't necessarily have to exist. There's definitely room to grow for us to be able to talk about how do we improve things, but you had a president that was only one-sided that continued to put gasoline on the fuel instead of trying to kind of calm it down and figure out how we all can heal together. Something that started before him, but he only, again, made it worse than what it was.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, we're going to learn a lot more in the coming days and weeks and months about exactly what happened on January 6th. And there's already evidence emerging that Michael Flynn's brother may have played a role in the slow walk of the National Guard. We're going to learn a lot more about the funding. We already know certain things about the funding, how this all was organized. And Donald Trump will undoubtedly, and it'll be Donald Trump et al., but they are undoubtedly, there's going to be a group of folks who played a very large role in both the rhetorical organization in terms of the rhetoric, the spreading of misinformation and propaganda via social media, via speeches, so forth, but also the actual on the ground organization in terms of how it all came about. And, I think, and then just putting January 6th and Donald Trump's administration in that larger context of this has been happening since he declared that he was going to run. His first, announcement speech, it was happening before he, as he was the face of the birther movement. I mean, so all of these things, are part of the picture of what leads up to January 6th.
See the questions sort of filing in here. One of the questions addresses the fact that we are in a time that perhaps people are less willing to have even have conversations because the issues that we're talking about are potentially polarizing. So how do we bring people together to even have a conversation? And if I may add to this question, is conversations what we need to be having, or is there a different strategy that we need to be using?
I mean, that last point you made is interesting. Is conversation, but should we be at a point where we have conversation? And I think conversation is important. I mean, if we aren't talking to each other, and then how are we going to move forward? And I guess the point I'm making is that right now we're talking at each other very loudly, and sometimes very violently, even physical violence, and that can only take place for so long before you find yourself at a stalemate. And I would say, in some cases, and some would say that we're at a stalemate right now. How do we move forward? Is the question, and those conversations, I believe, have to take place in order for us to be able to come to some sort of common space where we can begin the process of moving forward. I mean, even during the civil rights movement, there was negotiation. There was a place in which you could come to some sort of agreement that we need to figure out a way to deal with these issues. And that negotiation led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to many of the Great Society programs that were led by Lyndon Baines Johnson. It took a lot of negotiation and conversation to get there. And I think we're now at a moment where we're going to need to have those conversations, not just about the social justice movement, but also what are we going to do about public policy around the COVID crisis, public policy around climate change. All of those issues are still there, and all of them are connected. And to be able to move in a direction to deal with those issues, we have to have conversations.
Yeah, and I'll also like to piggyback. I like to piggyback on that too, and say, like you say, conversation is important. From 2014, during 2012, the George Floyd, what a lot of people don't, I think, realize or probably would think is, protesters, didn't even talk to police. There's this, there is a lot of energy and a lot of just history that has been around for so long, where even talking law enforcement is not just a fearful thing, but you don't even want to start with a conversation because you feel like nothing's going to change if there's no policy. But like the gentleman just said before me, I don't know what we need to do differently. Actually, I do. But one thing we need to continue to do is continue to have conversations. Being in a body where I'm super minority and I'm 48 of 116 Republicans, conversations are very important because we all have these different perceptions. If it's law enforcement, if you stay in urban area, if you stay in rural area, right? We have these beliefs and we have these biases, right? But until you really get to know a person, until you can understand where they come from, and like you say, even negotiate. If you just in the body that I work in don't negotiate and understand you're not going to get everything, much won't be able to get done. But I will say one thing that we can do differently that I think is starting to happen is actually start to elect people, and not just elect, but if it's community organizers, community organizations. One thing we've seen since Ferguson is community organizations that are actually being ran by people that are actually doing the work on the ground. You see individuals like Cori Bush, who just recently got elected to Congress, who has been someone who has been on the ground as an activist, but also has been on the ground working with law enforcement to try to figure out how do we create policies that actually move us all forward together. Because we can have conversations, but we also know with all the data and facts that are out there, some of these things can just need to change, you know, by policy or by law. And then some things are more complicated. So I think as we continue to have these conversations, which sometimes can feel like you're talking to a hard wall and not getting anywhere, outside of those conversations, we need to also move to policy, but also make sure that we have the right people in positions of power. And just my opinion, who will not be afraid and unapologetic to talk about things that sometimes is a little tough to talk about, but we cannot continue to hide and, you know, deflect from having tough conversations.
We also need to have those tough conversations in schools and start with when children are young and start teaching about the systemic racism and how maybe it can get changed, but we can't do anything if we don't know our history.
Ms. Bailey, I wanted to bring your voice into this because you talked about so specifically about this rhetoric of death to the media and the very clear danger that it posed to your student journalists, but to journalists all over. So can you speak a little bit about then how would we address, for example, that kind of rhetoric, and what kind of policies can we put in place that would better protect journalists who are essentially delivering a public good?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure in terms of a policy that could be or should be put into place specific to journalists. We are obviously there to serve and deserve the same amount of protection and support as anybody else who's in a public space, but certainly because we're there to do a job and we are there to represent the public in some way. I think more attention should be paid to it, certainly. Shouldn't be taken as a joke. Certainly on social media and whatnot, we've heard, you know, these kinds of ideas disseminated. All media is kind of lumped together and we're all bad and we're all, you know, so many other things. But if you talk to us about the local media, that kind of changes a bit when you realize we live next door to you, right? We're your neighbors, we're your colleagues in some instances. We vote, we do all sorts of things. So we go to the grocery store like everybody else. We're just regular people out trying to do a very important and very difficult job. And certainly in efforts to be transparent and efforts to be accurate. If we fail in those efforts, we expect and deserve, you know, the public to take us to task. But I think the dehumanization of journalists, along with, at least at the insurrection especially, but the dehumanization of journalists that I saw throughout the Trump presidency, especially that kind of really exemplified itself at the insurrection, was extreme. There have always been people who didn't like the media. I've never heard in my 30 years as a journalist as much direct language about causing physical harm to journalists, whether it's on Twitter or on Facebook or at events or any other way. So I think for us, for journalists, I know that there have been efforts among journalists themselves and among groups talking about safety, talking about ways to keep an eye out for each other and to remain safe from harm, talking about training and those kinds of things. But I think that really there needs to be just we are already human, but a rehumanizing of each other, that sometimes I think we lose that aspect when we talk to people or about organizations or institutions or people on a social media platform. We can more easily negate the humanity of all involved. It's more than just unfortunate. It is absolutely dangerous to the livelihoods of and the lives, literally, of a lot of people who are simply doing their jobs.
And if any other panelists want to jump in, I just watch for the mic the mute going off, and I'll just wait a few seconds if you want to jump in. Questions are rolling in from our attendees. One question, which sort of connects to what we were just talking about: should social media be held responsible for, quote, firing up both sides by allowing false information to circulate? We know that social media makes money on only showing information that people engage with, and it can be very one-sided. What's your take on what should happen to how social media manages and disperses information?
Well, I can say very quickly, just as a note for interest, the way that, and when we speak about social media, I'm assuming they're talking about the various platforms, right? Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and whatnot. And do note that it took some time, and it has taken some time, but specifically within the presidency of Donald Trump, I have noticed much later in that presidency that Facebook began to censor certain things and to take down Facebook pages and posts, as well as Twitter, which got rid of President Trump's Twitter account. So I think there has been some progress in that area in terms of them at least acknowledging their responsibility to truth and to accuracy to some level. In addition to that, I would love to know what the representative might think about something at a statewide or a national level in terms of legislation, because I'm not that familiar with that, but I think that certainly there have been some efforts, some may say too little too late in terms of what they have tried to do. When you look at some of the other websites for the organization, and I forget the name of it, so forgive me, but right after the Trump presidency, right after the insurrection, there was an organization where, was it Parler? Where some of the, I think it was Parler, where they actually lost their server or something, or some organization decided that they lost their server or something of that nature. And so hopefully somebody who can speak far more eloquently to what exactly happened can take this over now. But you've seen some things, and although maybe too little too late, you've seen some movement in that area.
What was I kind of missed the question a little bit. Could you repeat that?
So the original question was sort of the role that social media has played in galvanizing support for various various viewpoints or causes, and the question was that should there be any kind of policy that would potentially rein that in?
I can say social media has been extremely, helpful as an activist. I've been out there. One, not just to get people to come out to events, but also to be able to spread a message to folks that may not even be in your network. When you start using hashtags like say her name, say his name, Justice for Breonna Taylor, hashtag expect us, which is the big activist group that I am part of in the city of St. Louis. It's helpful. Twitter, I go back to 2014, Twitter, I never really used it till then, but it was a huge way for us to organize, stay communicated, but to be able to get the message out on a national level to CNN, to these big outlets, and also to be able to tell the truth. And I'll say since Ferguson, it's gotten better to now where we are controlling the narrative of what's happening, not only just at our actions and demonstrations, but the truth or the reality of what some of these actions mean, because people think that, we just constantly walk up and down the street, and that's not true. We're very strategic in different actions that we do. If it's on Police Brutality Day, where we brought shoes to the police department of all the individuals that have been murdered at the hands of law enforcement, or the blue tape on our mouths where we're saying, silence is violence, no matter if there's this, code or brotherhood or sisterhood in law enforcement. I'm not sure if any policies need to happen. I will say, I think we've seen with our president how social media can also be a negative in telling lies, and Twitter and those independent outlets did, I think, a really good job of not only suspending the account, but also certain tweets that were put out there that we known to be lies, and only continue to carry a narrative that was dividing. They were able to really shut that down. I'm not sure if I would, in this moment, say that from my side that we need any legislation around it, but I do know that there is a concern of how these social media outlets are so big and messages can be spread very quickly, and sometimes that information that's being put out there isn't accurate. And we know with social media, it's different from newspapers. You can make a tweet, you can make a Facebook post and not have all the right facts, and then that is shared amongst other people, and that becomes a reality, which is not the reality of what's actually happening.
Yeah, I think COVID's a good example here. When you look at the exposure to misinformation related to COVID versus more accurate information like the CDC's information, I mean, it's not even close. And this is primarily circulated through social media. So I think, when you look at the algorithms and how they're structured, they privilege certain types of emotive responses. And the whole goal is to keep people on the platform for advertising purposes. So I do think that, these are very large companies often. And I think there needs to be further exploration in terms of regulation and some of the liability issues that they're exempt from. I think we do need to, have a little bit closer look at social media, because it's only going to become more central to our lives, and it's already very central as it is, but that's going to only continue. So.
NP, could you say a little bit about how potentially social media is being used by some of the far right organizations that you have researched?
Yeah, so if you go back to the 1980s, white supremacists and other right-wing extremists were, using electronic bulletin boards. So they were forerunners in the use of this type of technology for social movement, political activism, going way back. And then certainly they were well positioned as social media and digital technology, further developed. They were well positioned to start to utilize this. So it's extensive. I mean, you'll find these folks using the mainstream platforms like Twitter and Facebook, all the way to the more secretive encrypted platforms like Telegram. We heard about Parler, which was a specific platform, developed specifically for more right wing that included, far right extremist folks as well. That was dedicated to that. So, even developing very specific platforms to get their message out. And really, they see social media as a way to shape the narratives, right? To get their message out to larger and larger segments of the population in order to push certain narratives. For example, the way in which immigration is framed as an invasion. You saw that in propaganda pre-social media among right-wing extremists, but they've been so effective at shaping that narrative that now you see that very, circulated very widely in really mainstream outlets. So, you can see propaganda, circulate on places like Facebook, and they have gotten a little bit more strict recently, but, until fairly recently, it was circulating very widely on these mainstream platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And, that's their goal, is to get their work, their message out as wide and far as possible, in hopes that they can bring the mainstream more in their direction.
Turning over to some of our submitted question. Question is saying, speaking of protests, what do you think of the two proposed bills sponsored by Missouri representatives that would offer legal protection for drivers if they hit a protester with their vehicle? Could this legal language potentially create opportunities for people to suppress protests with their vehicles?
Yeah, I would jump in on this one. So this bill is actually currently being heard right now in the Senate. They were able to actually strip out the part that if anyone used their car and strike a protester dead during a protest, that they're kind of justified. So that's not there. But what is in there is any like blockage of highways or uncivil disobedience, or I should say not uncivil disobedience, unlawful protests. And usually we're protesting in course in the streets or wherever we are. A whole point of a protest is to make people feel uncomfortable to a point where they're asking questions of what's going on, right? To call out some injustice and to get attention of the bad things that are happening, right? But usually, and that's going back to the relationship between protests and law enforcement, we to some extent have some level of a how do you say it, some type of communication without actually communicating with law enforcement when we're out there, right? But when we would have a point where they feel like the protest needed to be over, they would say it's an unlawful protest, you must leave. Usually it's a 5-minute, depending on who the captain is and what area you're in. You know, being in St. Charles is a lot different than being in St. Louis City. Being in St. Louis County is a lot different than being in North County. So it would vary. But at some point, they would get to the point where they say, now this is unlawful. If you do not leave, you'll be arrested. If the protest is, from what I've heard from the bill, if the protest is considered unlawful, there's higher charges now that can be brought up on protesters, even blocking the recent highway, which I was a part of. Can now be turned into from misdemeanors into felonies. So hopefully that language, I think, just is as bad as being able to hit someone with a car. We've seen what happened in Charleston when a female was hit by a charger from an individual who did not like what was happening, so he just drove through. There's been plenty of protests here where after the death of George Floyd, we had a protest at the Target in St. Louis City area. The Target had shut down because they was aware that we were coming, and a truck came through and literally, I mean, a big 4-wheeler truck, and just hit the gas. Everyone had got out the way. And then after he drove off, he had shot in the air. But this isn't, I think this is what we're seeing is continuing to try to say like protests and people from the far right trying to make it seem as if it's a radical thing, or as if it is okay to not abide by people's, honestly, First Amendment right, freedom of speech, right? Freedom to assemble, freedom to voice their opinion, but trying to penalize certain individuals from doing that, even in the Capitol during when the COVID outbreak happened. Again, going back to the response, and when we've seen people going up to all the capitals saying, hey, don't shut down government like they did in Jeff City, and they took to the streets, it was totally different compared to when we went up there and there was legislation that tried to make criminalizing individuals or juveniles higher penalties on them. So it is, I think it's a continuation of legislation and rhetoric that is stemming from the previous administration and trying to play up this notion that these folks are trying to defund the police, which means that they don't want to have services in the community. They're going to come in your house, and literally things we heard was in the Fosley case that we were going to come in, kill them, and kill their animals, continuing to paint people that are just asking for fairness and equality as if they are these scary individuals. It kind of make me think of a movie way back I was watching on the 13th Amendment, how they would display African-American men and women, you know, trying to beat up or abuse white women. And then, you know, the police would come and take them away. And, you know, it's that constant trying to paint individuals and say we need these laws, so many laws that we can really be enacting that can help people during a pandemic. But we need these laws to keep crime in order. We need these laws to keep, or I shouldn't say crime, law and order, but to keep crime down. So I'm happy that that part is out, but it is still a very egregious bill that isn't really addressing, you know, regulations around protests, if that is the case of what the senator feels about it.
Mayor Beth, if I can bring your voice back in here, do you see parallels between what's happening right now and specifically the post-World War II era in terms of tactics of suppression of protests?
Oh, absolutely. I'm sorry, I thought you said representative. I'll bow out.
That's okay. Dr. Brown.
Yeah, like he said, absolutely. Yeah, there's always suppression of trying to suppress protesters in one way or another. The ones that
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm seeing a question sort of bringing us back to social media. Earlier this year, because of the insurrection, platforms such as Twitter permanently banned former President Trump for inciting violence, which went against their guidelines. Do you think that this is an appropriate response?
Well, it's kind of hard to say whether it's an appropriate response because basically what the social media platforms have done is basically you've violated the terms of agreement that many people who utilize those platforms don't even read them before they sign up. So they don't know what they are, and they change over time. And you get the email that says, we've changed our terms of service. Please read these and click yes, you agree, or no, you don't. And most people just go straight to the bottom and click yes, they agree, and keep using it until something like this comes up. And then this is the mechanism by which these platforms use to take you off of the platform for whatever reason. And this is what they use against the president. And now people saying, well, they're infringing upon his First Amendment rights. Well, the courts have not clarified whether or not violating the terms of agreement for a social media platform sort of takes away your First Amendment right to say whatever you want to say on that platform that you agree to abide by the terms of to begin with. So this is part of the whole cycle that we have now, and now we sort of have this belief, or at least there are those who are making the statement that First Amendment rights are violated when you don't allow someone to say what they want to say or post what they want to post on a social media platform that's owned by a corporation. So therein lies the problem that the courts are going to have to settle.
I'm seeing a question here directed to Clint. You mentioned earlier that policing must change. How should we hold police officers who do commit police brutality or other crimes accountable? Many times officers' crimes are swept under the rug and not truly changed. How can we change this?
That's a really good question. And I think there's a change like that can happen at a lot of different levels. If you look around the country, a lot of state legislatures are writing laws about who gets to investigate police misconduct, whether the attorney general will come in and investigate deaths involving law enforcement. If an officer is fired for misconduct at one agency, can they be hired at another? The state of Iowa prohibits that now. So if you get fired in Iowa for misconduct, you don't get to work in the state of Iowa as a police officer anymore. And a lot of it comes down to local leadership. What do the policies say? What does the leadership say? And it's also about empowering officers to speak up when they see misconduct, training them how to address it, and guiding them through that process. And it's up to prosecutors to file charges when appropriate, to review cases objectively, whether it be getting a special prosecutor who doesn't have that relationship with the police officers. And we talk a lot about the injustices in the criminal justice system, but it's not just at the level of police, right? We have disparities in prosecution rates and sentencing rates, and in the length of time minorities are held in facilities, incarcerated, and it kind of spreads throughout. So there's accountability at a lot of different levels when it comes to how we're going to hold officers accountable when those few bad apples do rear their heads.
So I'm seeing kind of a follow-up question to the one earlier about the former president and his potential connection to the insurrection. The question reads, do you think that Trump's response to the insurrection, telling the protesters that he loved them and knew they were hurt because the election was stolen from them, led to the insurrectionists at the Capitol still believing that the election was stolen from President Trump? How can we change this belief? How do we fight the misinformation?
Well, I will say that I'm not sure you can change a belief, right? That's one of the most difficult things. What you believe, you believe. But certainly I do think that there's been a lot of really, really fine journalism done across the country on the issue of the insurrection, the timelines, the videos, what the police knew, didn't know, what the president said, how he said it, didn't say it, the timeline between what happened on Parler after the president's speech, and all of those things. And so you have a preponderance of evidence, it would seem to me. And so you can't change a belief with facts, unfortunately. Unfortunately. So I wonder whether I don't know that that anything that he said afterward. I mean, I think certainly for some of the folks who already believed it, what he said afterward reinforced the belief they already had, certainly. But I don't know that you can change that belief. Now, I have seen some media reports of some of the folks who've gotten arrested saying things like they felt like they had been tricked or fooled by the president, perhaps. That is one way that some of those folks can go back to others of a similar mindset, and they can get them to see facts a little bit differently, a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, I would agree with Ruby, and I believe the figures I've seen, it's about 50 million Americans that think the election was stolen, and large percentages don't think that January 6th was a riot, an insurrection. They think it was a legitimate protest. They think it was patriotic. So, I mean, we just have to keep in mind the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. Certainly individuals, kind of one-offs here and there, are coming around and for whatever reasons starting to have doubts. But I mean, this is a really large number of folks that we're talking about who believe this particular thing.
And I'll just say, to piggy off Ms. Ruby and Mr. Peter, I agree. I don't think you can really change people's beliefs on thinking that the election was stolen, even when you had, from the president's side, Republican election or Secretary of State members said there was no election fraud. You had countless court cases that said there was no election fraud. And still, I mean, the president was able to carry this message and people believed it. It makes me go back to, when he started the birther thing, right? Saying that President Obama was not from here, and how that took off and was such a thing for years, to the point where the president had to show his birth certificate, right? I don't think you can really change it, but I do think ones that have been held accountable has kind of got slapped on the head a little bit, or woke up and was like, wait, now he's gone. He's not being that outlet no more. He's not able to protect us. And maybe, it wasn't what we really believed it was. But, one thing I will say is we glorify, even as an elected official, we glorify elected officials. And I think the higher up you go from state rep to congressperson to a senator to a president, that almost like celebrity belief that we believe that they are makes it where, you know, that they aren't wrong, that they're always right because you want them to be successful. But, you know, we must hold everyone accountable, no matter if it's your family member or if it's a politician that is in the same party or with that you're in. That's one thing we don't like to do. And it's in our backyard, we like to look other ways, but when it's in other people's backyard, it's easy to call them out, but not hold our own accountable and continue to play into the rhetoric that, you know, it's just lies or that's not true, or the media. I mean, the whole fake news thing, the attack on media and the truth of what the media was doing, planting those seeds in people's heads for them to say, actually, yeah, the media is wrong, the whole QAnon theory thing. So I don't think you can really change people's beliefs. I do think over time, like Ms. Ruby said, as we continue to see the truth of what journalism or journalists have been putting out on what happened on January 6th, it will open up more people's eyes. But going back to like what Mr. Field said, you're talking about millions of individuals that some will just never change and will always believe what happened was, like Mr. Field said, them being patriots, them defending the Constitution. That was a protest that actually took place, not honestly, from the start of the president speaking all the way to the end, a crime scene that is still being investigated.
There's a question here connecting the Black Lives Matter protesters and early protests, which Dr. Brown touched on earlier. The discussion of protesters in the past being labeled communist reminds this person of the BLM protesters being labeled Marxist today. What do you think are the biggest misconceptions about the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think the biggest misconception of Black Lives Matter sort of connects with the way in which the civil rights movement in the 60s, Martin Luther King's movement, the women's movement you could go to, the LGBTQ movement, all movements are mislabeled as a way to delegitimize the issues that they're bringing up. And so I think, the Black Lives Matter movement is sort of dealing with that same sort of misperceptions as a way to delegitimize it and to sort of pull it out of the democratic process and the democratic principles that the country was founded upon. So if you can label it as the other, or somehow not a part of the democratic process that all of our, the principles of the country were built upon, then you can somehow sort of have people turn against it and then be able to effectively minimize it and ultimately destroy it. And I think that's a tactic that has been used against movements throughout our history.
Mayor Beth, can you address a little bit the sort of the misconceptions about the Black Lives Matter movement and how that might parallel how earlier protests were framed as well, specifically those that address human and civil rights?
Actually, I think Dr. Perry just did it. I don't really, I mean, I can't, he said it all. I mean, I was sitting here going, yeah. I mean, it's just, it's you want to take something positive and try to make it negative so that there is something you can be against and try to counter what the group is doing. I know also there's a lot of gender misconceptions with Black Lives Matter because it's often said that men are the leaders, but it was founded by 3 women. 3, right? 3? Yeah. And so that's something that has kind of gotten erased from history. I read There's a book called How We Got Free edited by Keonga Yamada Taylor. And she looks at the Combahee Collective, which was the Black feminists group in the 1970s. And they compare it with Black Lives Matter. And those are kind of interesting parallels to look at and see how most of the time what others think of the groups and their goals is radically different than what the goals of the organizations are.
One of the things I hear a lot in regards to BLM is that they're terrorists, even to the point of the claim that BLM killed 5 Dallas police officers, which is absolutely a lie. The person who killed 5 Dallas police officers was not affiliated with BLM. So just adding to what's already been said about that effort to delegitimize the negative, but I do hear terrorism a lot. And I I'll just be honest, I hear that for law enforcement too. I've been asked by law enforcement in trainings, why aren't you talking about Antifa and BLM? Why are you talking about white supremacists?
Yeah, and I would add on to it. For me, I remember, when the death of Trayvon Martin happened in 2012. I think I had just graduated at that time, and I was, not really aware of Black Lives Matter, even when we just recently had the death in 2014 of Mike Brown, and like the speaker before me said, Miss Mary, it was founded by, which we tend to forget, it was founded by 3 women. But in 2014, I think, Ferguson really shook the world in a way where it really elevated the Black Lives Matter conversation and just Black Lives Matter. And I remember during those days when we started to say, because it was started as hands up, don't shoot, before we were saying Black Lives Matter, right? And then once we started saying that, we instantly was hit with counter all lives matter, or why not white lives matter, right? I was on a Facebook post with my Republican colleague, and he had said something about the Black Caucus, and somebody's like, why don't we have a white caucus? So before people again wanted to even have a conversation, they didn't understand and was already creating a narrative. Oh, these Black folks only just care about Black people. They don't care about white folks, even though plenty of individuals, and when you see movements, plenty of individuals that are at the movement aren't always a lot of Black people. It's our white allies out there. So you have people that wanted to start a narrative off in 2014, going from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter, and missing the mark of why people, without listening or even trying to have a conversation, why people said Black Lives Matter, not just in our criminal justice system. I think Officer Clint and Ms. Mary said it. Also in our education system, in our housing system, and our in every economic system. I look outside my window right now and I see, buildings falling down, right? And I went to Parkway and being part of a DSEG school, those buildings did not look like the buildings that I see. The education was not the same. The healthcare, as we're in the middle of a pandemic, knowing that Black and brown people are not getting the same access to healthcare. And we don't even want to start on Hispanic people, right? Because we try to create divisions between Black people and brown people. But ultimately, trying to say, oh, these folks are saying Black Lives Matter and they don't care about all lives. And that's just is not true. And I think it's going back to trying to stir up a narrative. And once you get as many people to believe that narrative, then some people actually believe it's true, that they only care about Black lives, which was not true. So all that being said is you have individuals that from the very get-go wanted to display this movement as a one-sided, or, like the gentleman said, a terrorist group. They just want to loot and riot. This isn't protest. This is rioting. During Ferguson, there was some bad days, I would say that. But out of that 300 something days, the longest spark movement outside the Montgomery boycott of being unorganized, looting only happened about 2 days. Outside of that, you've seen organized protests from individuals that never organized before. So it's people just wanting to continue to, I guess, divide and stir up this us versus them, and not willing to listen and have a conversation.
And speaking of people who have organized who had never organized before, there's a question: how can we continue to be involved in the Black Lives Matter movement as protests have been slowing down? Any thoughts on people either wanting to re-engage or wanting to engage for the first time in substantive change in the community?
Just one thing: protests aren't just walking out in the streets and marching. You have other ways to protest. You can do economic boycotts of people whose policies don't support the overall goals, and also pushing for legislation and using your voices in that way. So there are lots of different forms of protest.
I think the phase that the Black Lives Matter movement is in now is voter participation. I mean, without the Black Lives Matter movement, you probably don't move into the Stacey Abrams movement, which led to what happened in Georgia. And now what you're starting to see is the backlash against those successes that Black Lives Matter and the movement, the voting movement down in Georgia and in other places. The backlash is now coming where you're having these pieces of legislation that come out that begin voter suppression. I think the one that has just been introduced in the state legislature having to do with having an ID, which was struck down by the state court last year, but now they're bringing it back in another iteration. And you're having these kinds of things that are going to come out. One of the things that I think the public and the media have to be cognizant of is when you have these kinds of successes, there's a backlash that comes immediately afterwards to try to suppress a lot of the gains that were made during those conversations, negotiations, and movement into policy, process, and law. And so that's sort of where we are right now.
And if you're interested in reading more about the history with those backlashes, Dr. Carol Anderson wrote a really good book called White Rage that happens to talk about that a lot.
I'll just say, Ms. Marriott, I feel like I just keep agreeing with everybody. But like Ms. Marriott said, there's many ways to protest. I always tell people we all have a role to play. You don't have to be like the loudmouth person at a protest like me with a bullhorn, screaming all day and then don't have no voice when you get home, right? There's many ways. You don't have to physically be out there to protest. You don't have to be protesting around criminal justice. Again, I think making sure that systems that are currently in place that are equitable and not equal, but equitable for people can be many ways. If it's writing your legislator talking about the photo ID bill or the bad ESA bill that we just passed that would disproportionately hurt people of color in St. Louis City, knowing that we're closing schools and will push more kids out, right? It's challenging your family members when you hear that nasty conversation at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? It's going on Facebook and just, if you feel like making a status about, hey, you can get involved this way or reach out to this organization to support them or even donating. I think there's many ways. And I think when people hear protest, the first thing they think is all out in the streets. And that isn't true. Everyone plays a role in this movement and liberating individuals and changing systems to make them equitable. I think it's just figuring out your comfortability level, your lane, and your place that you can help move and make change. Finding the right organization. I know, when it gets a little colder, folks stay in, but that doesn't mean that, organizing can't happen. You can create an online petition at change.org if there's an issue just on your block. We sometimes think on the bigger level, but things just start in your backyard, talking to people on your block about the crime that's going on, reaching out to your alder person, the council person, right? There's multiple ways that you can do it without believing, oh, if I'm not in the streets, I'm not playing a role. I would say this: if you're being silent and complacent, then you're not part of the progress. And sometimes people don't know how to be part of the progress. But by doing something or trying to reach out to a group or reach out to individuals to say, hey, how do I help, is a huge start.
There's a question here about the role. I'll just read the question. When protesters go against their predetermined protest agreement with the police, if they start looting, burning buildings, going past predetermined route, what actions should be taken? Should it be required to be more organized?
Well, I can tell you, we look at it and expect us, we look at each other as a family. And what that means is, if you come out to this protest, not only do we want to keep ourselves safe, because we're not getting paid. There's a belief, there's paid protesters. We don't get paid to spend 4 or 5 hours out in the streets away from our family, right? And when people come out with us, we also have a level of understanding that we're not only putting our safety at risk, but we're putting other people's safety at risk. And you want them to continue to come out. So the times that we've seen things go wrong here in St. Louis have been people that have not really been part of the protest, that have came to the protest for the first time, or they seen it and honestly took advantage of it. Again, when the Ferguson situation happened and people were looting and things got burnt down, I will say this: emotions for people was running high and still run high. You can, and I don't condone violence, but you can replace a building. You can replace broken glass. You can't bring back a life. You can't have a family member back at a table for Thanksgiving. And we look at the looting and we look at the violence sometimes of property more higher than the violence of life that was taken. But I will say that anytime that there's been things in St. Louis where it's gotten out of control, there's been people that have came to the protest to just want to take advantage of it. It's a lot of folks out there, and we try to be as organized as possible. We're having different organizers at different parts of the beginning, the middle, and the back. But sometimes, just like in the police department, like I said, it's only one bad apple. Sometimes it only takes one bad apple in the protest to do something and deter everything. And we try to make sure that our message is stronger. We continue to move forward, but if it happens, it's not usually the people that really want change, but people that are trying to take an opportunity of what is happening, that people have started to organize and come to the streets.
Clint, did you have a take on that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot what Representative Aldridge said, and our job is public safety, and he's right. Buildings and cars and things can be replaced, but human life cannot. And we locally we saw that here the first night that we had protests. Some young people, they looked young to me from a distance, but they took advantage of that and they started smashing windows at a retail store. And as those protesters were leaving for the night and walking by us being the police officers, they stopped and said, "Hey, that's not us." And we know that. We understand that. My response to them that night wanted to be, and that police officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck, that's not us, right? It's the same thing. He doesn't represent us, just like the people causing damage or taking advantage of an important moment don't represent everybody else. We know who's there for change, and we know who's there for really just for trouble or to take advantage of that situation. And one thing that I think that's been pervasive through the police culture is that there's some presumption or assumption of moral superiority over others, and that's never the case. No one has any moral superiority over another human being, including police officers. We're part of the community as well, right? So the representative hit it right on the head.
If I may, I would also say that as a journalist, it's incumbent upon us, and one of the things that we teach the students here at Mizzou is to make sure that we're extraordinarily careful with word choice, to refrain from always assuming that a demonstration or a peaceful protest, quote unquote, turned violent, right? Because you cannot say for sure that the people who were marching, peacefully walking, holding a sign were the same people, in fact, who did something later on in that evening in terms of vandalizing a building or throwing a brick or what have you. As the representative said, emotions run high, and you can't equate a building or a piece of of property with the life of a human being, but B, there's more than one type of person who shows up at a large gathering of people, right? So there may be folks who are there to peacefully protest. There may be folks who are there to protest loudly. There may be people who come along and come into the crowd and who simply either are overtaken by their own anger or who come into the crowd looking for an opportunity to do something else. And they really had no motive in terms of trying to be a part of a cause or to elevate the protest or the voices of those who are in the street crying out for justice in some way. So one of the things that, again, that we always talk about here is word choice matters so very, very much, being concise and being specific about what it is we saw or heard, going back to other sources and asking when you were there, were these folks with you or what have you, and not, no offense to you, Clinton, not always taking a police report as the Bible, because there's more than one source, right, for what happened at an incident. And we can paint a horrifically incorrect and wrong narrative simply by doing so. So.
And I think that we have time for maybe one more question. So I'm going to address the last attendee question. How does the media navigate coverage in this polarized environment? The norm of objectivity and presenting both sides of issues begins to fall apart when one side is spinning outright falsehoods. It took a long time for the press to label Trump's statement as lies, for example. So how does the media navigate coverage in this polarized environment? Just a short little question to end on.
Well, I'll start because the person who asked the question is absolutely right. It took a long time and far too long. And there are those of us who are in the industry who question the notion of objectivity, depending on how one would define that, and are looking for ways of more equitably being able to cover news and whether there is a role for advocacy and what it means to be biased and what it means to simply tell the truth, right? So I think that has brought the Trump presidency and a lot of these issues have brought those things to the forefront for many more journalists and at higher levels. So whether this has always been a conversation for journalists of color, there are others now who are also in more in line with at least questioning whether there's any such thing as objectivity. And if so, and if not, where does that leave us? And how should we be trying to represent voices, truth, right? Can we not simply say what's true, right? And it does make us look, it does, I think, make us look foolish when we cannot be truthful, when we cannot say something that as simple as this person told a lie or this was not true, right? We're not saying necessarily that they are a liar and that they're morally corrupt, simply that this person in this instance told an untruth and here's the fact, right? So it's been cumbersome, it's been clumsy, it's been ugly, but I hope that we are at a point where there are enough of us with a loud enough voice really amplifying that particular issue and taking a good look at it. So I think that's a great question.
I also would say that we're at a moment where we're starting to hold people accountable for not only what they do, but also what they say and what they put out there in either their name or someone else's name. And I think we're challenging the information that's out there. And we're looking not, my truth is different from someone else's truth. But I think where we are right now is we're starting to ask people to be authentic in what they say, what they do, how they act, decisions that they make. And that I think will hopefully get to more trust, because I think that's what's missing. And I think part of it, part of the way to get there is to try to seek that authenticity and seek it in a way that's respectful of the way in which people live their lives and their experiences. And I'm hoping, or at least what we're trying to do at the Missouri School of Journalism, is teach our teach our students to understand that as journalists, as communicators, it's our responsibility to tell authentic stories in a way that will educate others about the way in which people live their lives. And so if we can achieve that or some semblance of that, I think we can move the conversations and then hopefully all the other issues forward.
Any final remarks? We're right about at that time. I want to thank our panelists for your time, for bringing your expertise to us. I really appreciate it, and letting me learn from all of you has been a really it was a treat for me. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Sarah.
Yes, thank you so much to this wonderful panel, and thank you to everyone that has tuned in live and also maybe watching this later. I did want to let you know that this video was recorded, if you did not see that lovely little red button at the top left, and it will be available via our Columbia College YouTube posted there later next week, so you can view this later if you would like. And then I believe that there is a survey that I hope you will get once the webinar closes. I'm not for sure because this is my first one that I've hosted, but I think that when you close this, there's a short survey that we would love for you to take if you have the time. It's just a few questions. And other than that, we appreciate you for being here. Thank you, Ahu, for moderating. Thank you for our wonderful panelists. Oh, and I did want to mention one more thing for those of you that are enjoying our Columbia College Black History Month programming. This program was a part of that series. And so we have one more event that is coming up. We typically have our annual Black Expo, and so that is being hosted in collaboration this year. You can visit columbiaready.com for more information about that. I believe that is tomorrow. So thank you so much, and we will stop recording, and feel free to let us know if you have any questions. Thank you so much.